For the vast majority of human history, economic output per person remained stagnant. Generations lived and died with almost no change in their material conditions. This thousands of years flatline was suddenly broken in the 18th century as the Industrial Revolution took hold. This shift was driven by a surge in productivity. In economic terms, productivity is defined as the amount of output produced per hour of work. When output per hour began to rise, it permanently elevated the economic well-being and living standards of people throughout the world. To understand our modern world, we must identify the specific mechanisms that triggered this historical explosion in productivity. This timeline of productivity growth over the last 300 years visualizes the magnitude of change, starting with a baseline that barely moved before 1800. Significant accelerations occurred during the Second Industrial Revolution and the Internet and mobile technology revolution. What exact mechanical levers exist within an economy to generate these massive, sustained spikes in prosperity? We can find the answer by building the theoretical engine of an economy from scratch, starting with a blank slate. By systematically constructing what we call the aggregate production function, we can determine which inputs guarantee growth and which lead to inevitable stagnation. We begin with the most basic input, labor, or L. Our starting equation is y equals F of L, where y represents real GDP. This curve visualizes the relationship between labor and output. Hiring the first few workers results in a rapid jump in output, shown by the initial steep slope. However, as more labor is added, the curve flattens. Each additional worker adds less to the total. Economists define this mathematical flattening as diminishing returns to labor. In practice, workers eventually begin crowding the same workspace and sharing the same tools, making each new hire less effective. Because of diminishing returns, a society cannot achieve infinite economic growth simply by increasing its population or mandating longer working hours. This brings us to our second input, physical capital, or K. Our equation expands to y equals F of K and L. Physical capital refers to the tangible resources used in production, such as machinery, factories, and transport vessels. Injecting more capital shifts the entire production function upward. The exact same number of workers can now produce significantly more output because they are equipped with better machines. But an economy cannot simply buy infinite prosperity. As we stack these curves representing additional units of capital, a familiar pattern emerges. The vertical gaps between the curves shrink. Each new factory provides a smaller boost than the one built before it. This is the capital trap. Because physical capital also suffers from diminishing returns, relying solely on building more infrastructure will ultimately lead to economic stagnation. If neither more people nor more machines can sustain infinite growth, a third variable must be responsible for the modern world. We introduce technology, or T, to complete the aggregate production function, y equals F of L, K, and T. In this context, technology encompasses any new knowledge or process improvement that increases output produced with a given amount of labor and capital. A critical form of technology is human capital, which represents the accumulated knowledge and skills of the workforce. We see this in learning by doing. In complex environments like aircraft assembly, workers become vastly more efficient over time simply by repeating a task. Technology acts as a multiplier. It increases the total output possible from existing levels of labor and capital. This multiplier allows an economy to bypass the physical constraints that eventually limit the effectiveness of workers and machines. Why is technology uniquely immune to the diminishing returns that eventually cripple physical capital and labor? It is due to a defining economic property called non-rivalry. Unlike a physical tractor, a new mathematical formula or software protocol can be used by millions of people simultaneously without being used up or degraded. Because of non-excludability and the spillover effect, one technological breakthrough naturally leads to others across adjacent industries. Since ideas can be shared infinitely without wearing out, technological progress can compound indefinitely, making it the primary engine of long-term economic growth. How do economists actually quantify the impact of something as invisible as technological progress? They use the growth accounting formula. This tool decomposes historical economic data into measurable parts. First, we measure the overall growth rate of an economy's total productivity. Next, we can exactly measure the growth rate of physical capital added per hour of work. By subtracting capital's contribution from the total, the remaining unexplained growth is officially categorized as the growth rate of technology. In macroeconomics, we don't measure technology by counting patents. We measure it by calculating the massive surplus of growth that labor and machines cannot explain. We can now apply this mathematical framework to the historical productivity data. When the growth accounting formula is applied to the massive economic booms of the late 19th century and the 1990s, the source of that prosperity becomes clear. Mathematical analysis proves that the accumulation of physical factories and machines accounted for only a small fraction of these historical spikes. Instead, the vast majority of these explosions in prosperity were driven by the technology variable. The aggregate production function demonstrates that while workers and infrastructure are necessary to set a baseline, they cannot sustain growth on their own. The upward trajectory of human prosperity relies entirely on our ability to innovate, accumulate human capital, and deploy new technology.